attempting to unpack the key themes from the book of Daniel. Are you loving the book of Daniel? It's a great book, isn't it? I love Daniel. This Uncompromising Life series. And I started the series 2 weeks back by speaking about living with conviction in a culture of compromise. Living with conviction in a culture of compromise. Now, since then, I read a human rights article on a Christian woman in China who in 2018 apparently was arrested by the Chinese Communist Party police and later detained for 22 days in a re-education camp. According to the article, the detainees in this facility, Christians, were denied food or sleep unless they renounced their faith. Whilst under constant surveillance, apparently she even had two minders who would go and sleep in the same room with her on either side, and they'd be watching her if she prayed. And just this constant kind of feeling of, you can't do anything without people being there or watching you. Constant surveillance, video cameras as well. They were taught Chinese propaganda, forced to sing songs, thanking the Communist Party, and were forced to write words to blaspheme or curse God. Upon her release, her husband was even coerced to prevent his wife from believing in God, and apparently she continues to live under the constant surveillance and fear that she might be arrested or even potentially have her public rental house seized. It's been estimated that around 100 million Christian or people of faith, Chinese people, that's nearly 1/3 of the estimated people of faith in that country, face up to high to very high levels of persecution. 1 million people. And yet, despite the tightening controls, millions of religious believers continue to defy official restrictions daily and engage in some kind of protest. It's one thing to talk about the influence that our culture in Australia has on us and in trying to promote worldly values or to distract us or deter us or take us away from the Christian faith. But it's another one to actually face persecution as seen in other countries, isn't it? I think that we don't want persecution in our country. We want to pray for the ability to continue to keep doing what we're doing. But it's sad that sometimes it takes persecution in order for something to happen. It takes persecution for people to actually step up and take a stand and go, hey, no! Because at the moment, we're very much relaxed and sitting back, and I'm not sure that the church is really engaging that much. The church globally is engaging that much in actually standing against what we believe. And that's why I think the book of Daniel is so important in helping us to understand how God continues to provide and protect his people even when pressured. You think about Daniel and his friends, four young blokes who, it wasn't really until, you think the reason why they're in that situation in the first place is because of their lack of faith, because their unwillingness to actually serve God and obey his commands, and it took them to be in a foreign land under persecution for them to actually really take a stand. And it's so sad that sometimes that's how it is. But that's why Daniel is actually so important to us, to remind us. Now as we approach chapter 3, we've done 1 and 2. Up until this point, Daniel and his friends have only had to face indoctrination by the Babylonian state. But now as we approach chapter 3, we see firsthand persecution. They face persecution for their faith. So we're going to look at Daniel 3 this morning. And because it's so long, we might be here all week if I read the whole thing, maybe not quite. So I'm just going to paraphrase a lot of it and just read little bits out of it. So if you remember, just give you a recap. The Israelites have been taken captive by the Babylonians, and their king Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, has selected a select group of nobles from within the Jewish society to be trained in the culture and the ways of Babylon. Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, are among them. And at the start of chapter 3, we read that King Nebuchadnezzar has this huge or large golden statue made, about 27 metres high and 2.7 metres wide, so a substantial statue. And he summons all the representatives from across the Babylonian Empire. You think about Babylon was, at the time, it was the known world. A bit like we think we probably know Rome better and how big that was at the time. Babylon was huge. And so these people would have travelled long distances in order to be at this dedication that he has for this image. And as they stood before this image, we pick up from verse 4, it says, the herald loudly proclaimed, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But the story doesn't finish there. You know, there's some astrologers within the empire who had a bit of a grudge against the Jews, and specifically made an example of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. Daniel was apparently smart and wasn't there at the time because he's not mentioned in this story, but you know, they are singled out because of their disobedience in following the king's order by not serving the gods, the Babylonian gods, or worshipping the image of gold made. So the king is furious, and he summons them, but gives them an opportunity to change their ways, with the threat, of course, of being thrown into the furnace. And so we pick up in verse 16, and it says, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. No, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. This is kind of like a bit of a humorous bit. You know, the king gets so angry. You know what happens when you get angry? You know, things go badly. You know, he gets really fuming at this stage, and so he orders that the furnace be made hotter, 7 times hotter than usual, and he gets his strongest men to bind these 3 young Hebrews and to throw them in the fire. But in the process, the soldiers get burnt and killed. But what happens? The king looks into the fire and sees these 3 young men walking around in there with this other strange fellow. We're not going to talk much about him today. I'll pick up with that in a couple of weeks' time. There's this other person who appears in that fire, who he actually calls the son of the gods. And he calls out to them and calls them out. And then we pick up in verse 28, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to God of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except for their own God. It's a great story, isn't it? You know, some of you have probably heard it so many times, perhaps even in Sunday school growing up. And there's so many things that we could talk about this morning, and some of the other things we'll be picking up later on in the series. But today I just want to talk about idolatry. But I feel like we need to define what idolatry actually is. You know, so the Eastern Bible Dictionary defines idolatry as image worship or divine honour paid to any created object. This is probably what comes to mind when you read about idolatry in the Old Testament. You think about objects like golden statues, or like the golden calf, wooden trinkets, or even images to deities. But broadly speaking, you probably also heard it said that an idol can be anything that substitutes God. Right? An idol can be anything that substitutes God. And broadly speaking, that's correct. And that could be practically anything that becomes more important to us than God, can therefore become an idol. That could be getting good grades. It could be approval from other people, success in business, a hobby. In fact, even a person's preoccupation with sport could therefore become an idol. However, whilst there are many things that seduce us in this world and draw our attention away from God, which is bad, don't get me wrong, I personally don't believe that these things are necessarily idols. Now, I know I'm going against popular thought here, bear with me, but I actually think it's really important to get our terminology right. Why? Because I think idolatry, particularly when you look through the Bible, through the Old Testament, is such a horrid thing that comes up it's riddled all the way through. It's even mentioned in the New Testament. It's such a horrid thing that if we actually, and I'm not saying it's not bad, anything that we substitute for God is bad, and if you want to think of it as an idol and that helps you, then by all means. But in the Bible, it's actually seen to be such a horrid, terrible thing and so destructive that if we just make a bit of a loose kind of interpretation of what an idol actually is, we don't actually fully get to the heart or realise how damaging it really is. So bear with me. So this theologian, R.S. Rosner, provides this framework which I'm working with today. And he believes, and he says that if you look through the Old Testament, you look at what the expectations of idol worship is, he says this. Idols are things that require obedience. Yeah? They are something that people serve, or someone that they serve. Idols demand love and affection. Idols require people to put their trust and confidence in them. Obedience, affection or love, trust. And we see all these things in the Daniel passage too. You see Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego are ordered to serve the Babylonian god. They expected to worship and even put their trust in the king's idol, worship being the ultimate expression of love. And I believe these elements are also consistent with other biblical narratives and descriptions of idol worship and of what's expected of idol worship in the Bible. And they make sense to me because, and it makes sense why God is so objectionable to idols, because they undermine human relationships with Him more than any other sin. They ultimately lead people also into more destructive, sinful behaviour. After all, they are the things that God requires of us too. What does He require us? Obedience, love and trust. So it's taken away those things that God requires of us and replacing them with something else. As I said, if you want to think of football, if you're preoccupied with football as being an idol and that helps you, by all means, but I'm not sure how football necessarily fits within those categories. That's not to say that a preoccupation with it isn't bad, right? It's not to say that if anything that preoccupies your time is not a sin. But what I am saying is that I think if you really want to understand what idol worship is about, it's these three things that actually undermine our relationship with God, most and foremostly. R.S. Rosner says, idolatry is an attack on God's exclusive rights to our love, trust and obedience. And at the heart of idolatry is selfishness or greed. We read in Ephesians 5, we jump to the New Testament, and it says, "For of this you can be sure, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such as a person is an idolater, has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God." And in Colossians 3, 5-6, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, and evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. For these, the wrath of God is coming." As such, things like money, the pursuit for possessions, or even all that kind of stuff, or even people can be idols if you lust after them. If they, like for example, money, people who love money or have a lust for money are devoted to them. They love it. They put their trust in it, and they are under its control. So in that case, just like a person who demands unwavering attention or affection and commitment could also be an idol, because at their heart it is driven by selfishness. So what are the implications of idolatry? All right. First off, idolatry goes against God's command. Let's start off with the obvious one. It goes against God's command. That's where the obedience bit comes in. So it says in Exodus 20, 2 to 6, the first two commandments of the Ten Commandments, it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods beside me. You shall not make of yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord, Yahweh, your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third to the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, who would have been familiar with God's commandments, were obviously not willing to break them under any circumstance, even if that meant being thrown into a furnace. Now, I touched on this a few weeks back, but generally speaking, believers are called to obey civil authorities. Sometimes that's hard, but that's what we're called to do, but only when the rules don't violate God's commands or prohibit us from worshipping or practicing our faith. Yeah?
Amen.
And under such circumstances, God's rule takes priority. It is appropriate then to take a stand and reject the rules imposed on us if they go against directly God's commands. As you probably know, there are many laws now in Australia, and laws which are about to be passed, which are in direct conflict with Christian faith. For example, when people of faith are treated or threatened with jail for praying for someone with an unwanted sex attraction, or threatened with jail for praying for someone who is just distressed about their inner sense of gender identity. Seriously, Houston, we have a problem. Or what about religious bodies such as Christian schools, who may soon be denied the right to select staff who adhere to Christian or religious beliefs, the beliefs of the organisation, or refuse to take disciplinary action against a staff member who breaches the moral codes or values of that organisation. You know, eventually more and more will be put on the spot with regards to our values and beliefs.
Amen.
And at some point, like Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, we may even be confronted with a requirement placed upon us by our government or ruling authorities to go against the first two commandments. And when that kind of time comes, or if that time comes, how will we respond? Will our faith continue to influence our decisions we make, or will we go with the flow of the world's opinions? You know, it's interesting, if you look at the book of Kings, the kings are assessed not based on how many achievements they've had, or by their leadership qualities, or the great structures that they've built. They're actually assessed on whether or not they got rid of idols, or whether or not they introduced idols. That's what they're assessed on. And this shows how important idol worship actually is, and despised and hated by God. Now, it'll be interesting in 20 years' time or more when we look back at New Horizons, how will people assess us? How will people assess the church in Victoria? How will people assess the church in Australia? Have we been willing to stand up for our faith, no matter what the cost might be? And the cost might be huge, but are we willing to do that? Number two is, idolatry is a form of prostitution. Have you ever heard the expression, words are cheap? Words are cheap. And this expression is especially true when it comes to love. If we really want to express our love, then we need to put it into action. In effect, and that's what we do when we worship. Worship without love is meaningless. You know, in worship we express our admiration to God in response for all that He's done and is continuing to do, and show our gratitude for He first loved us. And the ultimate expression of that was Jesus Christ, who came and died for our sins so that we could be restored, forgiven, renewed, planned way before we even came along. He first loved us. What greater love could there be than this? Now, a common metaphor for God's relationship with Israel is that of a marriage, where God acts as a husband to his people. And as such, God cared for his people, he provided for his people, he protected his bride, but what did Israel do? They turned and worshipped other idols, and therefore were found unfaithful. You know, as such, idolatry is viewed as a form of prostitution and was ultimately the cause of Israel's demise. You know, the reason why the Jewish people, they're in actually Babylon right in this story, is the direct result of their unfaithfulness to God. A fact that Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego were well aware of. And as such, they were not willing to bow down and prostitute themselves before King Nebuchadnezzar's idol. You know, whilst maybe some of the other Jewish captives may have thought that God had deserted them, they knew, these three young men knew of God's faithfulness and covenant commitment to his people, and as such were not willing to allow themselves to be bound to the gods of Babylon. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament warning the Galatians says this in Galatians 8. Formerly you did not know God. You were slaves to those who by nature are not gods, idols. But now that you know God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable forces? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? Whilst dedicating ourselves to idols enslave us and make us dependent upon them, true worship actually frees us. It changes us from the inside out and opens us up to the transforming power of the Holy Spirit. You know, I don't think we realise that when we come to worship, it's not just what we do here on a Sunday morning, it's what you do in their everyday life. When you actually worship God, you know, if your mind's not on, if you're getting caught up with the stuff of the world and getting grumpy, it changes your heart and you become grumpy. You know, if you're angry at people, you become, or something's happened to you, you get angry and fired up about it. But when you actually have a state of worship and you're giving the glory back to God in all that you do, in love, it changes who you are from the inside out. And so when you're angry or got other stuff going on, your heart, it's like this wall that's there, but when you worship, the wall's gone and you're actually, for the first time, willing to receive from God. Amen. Worship is actually so important. All right, thirdly, idolatry separates us from God. That's where the trust component comes in. Now, apparently there were heaps of idols in Babylon, and so it got me thinking, why did Nebuchadnezzar, the king, want to build another one? You know, surely he's got enough there already. Why did he need another idol? That's how my brain works. And so I'm thinking about it, and I'm thinking maybe the answer lies in what the image symbolised. Now, it is suggested that the image represented the god Nabu, whose name formed the first part of King Nebuchadnezzar's name, meaning protect my son or protect my boundary. And I thought this was interesting that despite being the most powerful human being on the planet at the time, it seems that even he was in need to put his faith in something for protection. And ironically, while he was putting his trust in a statue, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego put their trust in who? God. So what we actually see in this story is a bit of a showdown between two gods. It's just like a Marvel movie or something like that, isn't it? You know, you've got the man-made God of gold versus the living God. Amen. And as John mentioned last week, the Babylonians already believed that the God of Israel, the God of Judah, had deserted them. You know, because after all, the Israelites were taken captive. And the Babylonians were able to raid the temple and take all the possessions, the articles of the temple, and put it into their God's temple. But as we read at the beginning of Daniel, it says, it was the Lord who delivered the king of Judah into the hands of the Babylonians. It was actually God who was in control all along as a punishment for their nation's unfaithfulness. Now, I wonder whether or not the reason why idolatry is so enticing to people is that as humans, we innately have trouble putting our trust in something that we can't touch or we can't see. The classic example being doubting Thomas, one of the apostles, who needed proof of Jesus' resurrection, right? And before the coming of Christ, God chose not to reveal himself in a visible form, but rather chose to make himself known through words instead. I mean, after all, you can't reduce the creator of the universe down to just one thing in creation. However, as the prophet Jeremiah promised, God has given us, there was a promise of new hearts, and he has given us, now that we're in the New Testament period, he's given us new hearts so that we might truly know him better. Jeremiah, this was his promise, his prophecy in chapter 31. And this is from the Message version, because I really like the Message version. It says, I will put my law into them, write it onto their hearts, and be their God. They will be my people. They will no longer go around setting up schools to teach each other about God. They will know firsthand because it's written on our hearts. As Christians, we have the Holy Spirit who convicts and guides each and every one of us. That's why we need to worship, we need to be open, right? And unlike the Israelites, we have the ability to know God, his character, and to be able to have a personal and intimate relationship with him. And yet, many believers, many Christians, are still tempted to put their trust in idols. One of the big ones is obviously money, with the hope that it will bring some kind of security or prosperity. But as the Bible says, misguided trust in such things only draws our attention away from God and a relationship with him. 1 Timothy 6:17 says, and this is his warning, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides for us with everything for our enjoyment. Where do you place your trust? Is it in worldly possessions? Is it in money? Is it in other people? Where are your idols? Are you placing your trust in the things of this world, or are you placing it in God? Finally, idolatry distorts our identity. I'm adding the next one in there, image. It's funny how over the centuries, artists, sculptors, whatever it might be, have attempted to make all kinds of images depicting what they think God might look like, or what they would like God to look like. Yet God's image and likeness has already been revealed to the world since the very beginning. Where? How? Yes, but in human beings, each and every one of us. You know, humans, we're actually the pinnacle, the climax of creation. And we're made in what? The image and likeness of God. We're obviously not the exact image of God, but we are designed to reflect his nature as his representatives on earth. We're meant to mirror him. And although sin has greatly tarnished our likeness, unlike the animal kingdom, every aspect of our being, such as our moral, spiritual, intellectual, relational, and even our physical bodies, were designed to reflect his glory as the creator. And this is our ultimate. If you want to know what your purpose in life is, our purpose in life is to reflect the glory of God. Now, some people that might sound very restrictive, but it's actually the complete opposite. Because if you do what you're actually designed to do, it's like trying to get a car to fly. You know, what is a car designed to do? Drive. When you're actually doing what you're created to do, then it's actually quite freeing. Hebrews 1-3 says that Christ is the radiance and God's glory, and the exact and it is the exact representation of God, in which believers in Christ have been conformed into and being transformed into the likeness of him. So although our likeness may have been tarnished, we've actually been transformed, and are continuing to be transformed into his likeness. Go back to Adam and Eve in the garden, we're actually being transformed back into something greater, into the likeness of Christ, into who we were originally created to be. However, when we worship idols, put our trust in other things like idols, we become twisted versions of what we are supposed to be. We actually start becoming what we worship, counterfeit versions of ourselves. Worshipping idols distorts our true identity and replaces it with something else, making it impossible for us to truly achieve our purpose in mirroring God and his glory. By being true to themselves, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego glorified God as image bearers with astounding results. Not only did God protect them and save them, that's the thing that we focus on, but we don't focus so much on how God used them to glorify himself in an amazing way. We pick up in, I'm going to jump to Daniel 4, 1-3, and this is King Nebuchadnezzar's confession. And it says this: King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom, his dominion endures from generation to generation. What an amazing testimony. What an amazing response. Here's a king who initially set up an idol and told and forced everyone to worship down to it, to bow down to this idol, who's now proclaiming the King of Kings, who's now actually also, and when we read that bit, gives a warning to anyone who runs down the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. If you run them down, I'm going to rip you into pieces. Don't defile that God. Not quite what God had in mind, but anyway, it's an amazing turnaround, isn't it? I was young once. When I was at, I'm trying to find my notes. The musicians would like to get up. When I was young adult and at Bible college, as a young student, I went on a short-term mission trip as part of my course. And it's part of that we did a whole lot of things that we were expected to do. And at the time, I think I've said to you before, that I was very shy and timid, believe it or not. I actually didn't really like getting up and speaking in public. And one of the things we had to do was actually share our life testimony. The idea made me physically sick, but that's what we had to do. I had to share my testimony in front of a crowd. And my time came along at a dinner function where there was a crowd of people who did not look like they wanted to be there. Can I say? They looked bored out of their brain. And I was sat on a table with these two young guys, about 16 years old, and they taunted me. Back then I was even more conservative than I was then, my big part and always immaculately dressed. And by the time I came to speak, imagine, I was already nervous, and then by the time I got to speak I felt so self-conscious, and I'm like, oh, I can't do this, I feel sick, I really feel sick, I do not want to go and do it. But I persisted because my marks were on the line. If I was in church or something like that, I'd probably go, no, doing it. I'm not doing it. But my marks were on the line, so I got up and I did it. And I got it over and done with as fast as possible. As soon as it was done, I ran out, went to the toilet and locked myself in there. A little later, my lecturer came looking for me. And he knocked on the door, you're going to come out at some stage. Oh yeah, I did so badly. He said, no. you missed what happened after you left the room. Those two young guys who were sitting on your table, they got up for prayer, and one of them gave their life to Christ. And I'm like, what? That doesn't make sense. They ragged me the whole time. I felt like they hated me. And they said, no. They really related with what you had to say. And not only that, they actually really appreciated that you tried to engage with them, that you tried talking to them while everyone else just ignored them. Everyone else just thought it was a naughty little kid. I was just trying to make friends. We really do not know what's going on in people's hearts and minds, do we? And we can't always see how God is already at work in them. In fact, we will never know to what degree we have impacted on people's lives. How sharing our life impacts people. We may never know. But what we do know, that as image bearers for Christ in this world, we have been called to reflect God's love in word and in deed. And when we dedicate ourselves to something other than God, we are unable to do that. We're actually not fulfilling our purpose. And it's not actually us who's doing the work, is it? It's actually God working within us. It's allowing ourselves to be his instruments, his vessel. Yes, sometimes if you're like me, you might tell yourself that I've got nothing worthwhile contributing. Or convince ourselves that we are so flawed that therefore we are unworthy to be used by God as his ambassadors in this world. But these are just lies. Can I tell you, they're lies? I get angry when I say, hey, would you like to share at church? I go, no, I don't think I like to. I don't think anyone wants to listen to me. I've got first-hand experience that that's not true. Someone, at least one or two people have something we'll have in common with. I'm too flawed. I'm such a sinner, how could I possibly... Actually, no, that's not true. It's actually not true. You've been saved, you've been redeemed, you've been restored. Amen. These are just lies. Yeah. We need to remember that Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego were just three ordinary young blokes who were just going about the business of living their lives as best as they could for God in a really tough situation. In a world of compromise. They were no one special, yet because of their obedience in God, their love for God, and trust in God, they were able to reveal God in an everlasting, amazing impact on the world. We remember this story because of these guys and what they did. And maybe that's why people love this story so much, is because, it's three young guys who took the stand for what they believed. They survived, and not only that, they got to change the world in the process. We may not all of us will necessarily get the opportunity to change the world with such a big impact, but we just never know if we never try. Who knows? Maybe someone in this room, God has, he's got big plans for all of you, but maybe there's really big plans somewhere out there. We just need to be faithful. Although uncertain and perhaps dangerous times lay ahead of us, each and every one of us have been called to be like these three young men. Amen. Obedience, love, and trust. Obedience. Are you being obedient to God in regards to your attitudes and commitment? Are you being obedient? Love. Are you spending time with God in order to develop that relationship with him? You want to know God better? It's like a relationship. You can't really love someone unless you spend time with them. Well, you could, but it's not real, like intimate. If you've got a partner, a spouse, you need to spend time with them. We need to spend time with God. Trust. Are you living it with conviction, dependent on God for all your needs? I'm going to leave you with that this morning. Well, let's just pray. Lord, we just thank you for your word. We thank you that you are willing to use us, that you want to use us, and that we have the opportunity to reflect you Sometimes it's a bit of a distorted reflection because we don't always get it right. But in faithfulness, we actually pray that you'll just, continue to restore us into your likeness and image and likeness of Christ, so that we can actually reveal to the world through our actions, through our behaviour, you. And then they'll actually see what you are actually really like, not some fake or distorted image. They actually see what you're really like, Lord Jesus, through ourselves and through our words and actions. We also pray for the temptation to put our trust in other things that, delude us in thinking that we have this sense of security in life, when in fact, it's just not true. Money comes and goes. Possessions, moths and rust destroy. They disappear. You can't take it with you. People who are demanding or dictatorial and demand every part of our being and try to replace that relationship we have with God, they have no place. They'll pass away. They will not have no place in God's kingdom. We need to focus on you, Lord. Help us to do that and put our trust in you. So that one day we just not glorify you here on earth, but one day we may be able to sit with you eternally and to praise you and to celebrate with you and to love you without any restrictions, Lord Jesus. We pray. Amen. If you like prayer, please feel free to come up at the end of this service. We'd love to pray for you. If there's things that are in your way, restricting you, barriers which are in your way from helping or stopping you from trusting God, I pray you come forward and let's pray over that and let's break some of that, Lord. Also, if there's idols, things that are there that are actually replacing your dedication, your commitment, your focus with God, let's just pray through that too, Lord. We just pray through that so that we can actually break that, and actually so that you can actually be free from the chains that actually bind you.
When the enemy surrounds and my heart works faintly weary, when the darkness overwhelms and my fears are pressing in, I will trust in you alone. In the silence I will wait.
If you are new to the church or visiting for the very first time, can I encourage you to fill in one of the welcome cards that you received as you came in this morning? Up and coming services. On Sunday the 19th of February, we'll have our service of reflection with speaker Natalie Stoner. In the evening, we'll have our prayer meeting starting at 7 p.m. online only. On the 26th of February, we'll have our service of celebration again with speaker Pastor Rohan Buijs. Reminder that Rev Kids is on every week now during school term times. We would really appreciate it if you were able to fill in the expression of interest form that you were provided with as you came in this morning. This can be placed in the offering bag as it comes past. Please ensure you have your name on the form.